to this lunch and learn on project management basics. So please stay muted. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and you can use the chat for questions. We'll cover questions kind of throughout the presentation and also at the end, kind of depending on time. So please feel free to send in your questions in the chat. You can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and we'll get that link for you in the chat. Just wanted to go over our land acknowledgement. So Petrati would like to acknowledge the land that we're all on. And then next up, we have Travis Rappleye. So in this Lunch and Learn, Travis will outline how project management needs change as MedTech projects progress from concept through commercialization and the tools and resources required at each stage. Travis Rappleye is a MedTech startup project management expert with over 2 decades of experience managing a variety of projects through all phases of development, including Class 2, Class 3, combination products, and pharmaceuticals. So, Travis, go ahead and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Adrian. I am going to go through the same process of sharing my screen and then switching. So bear with me for a second here. That's my family. My oldest one on the left there just got accepted to Portland State. So we might be somewhat local soon. Okay, display settings, swap. Okay, can you make sure that Adrian confirmed that I'm on the right screen? You're seeing the big one? Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, having spent all of my time in startups and struggling along the way. I hope that this is informative to everybody. It's kind of a basic just overview of how I apply project management principles in startups. It's different in a pre-commercial setting than in a commercial setting, and so I wanted to share some of my learnings along the way and how I do things. Oh, I started off in the wrong place. Okay, there we go. There's me. So just agenda-wise, I'll go into an about me, just kind of give you a background of myself and what I've gone through. And then I wanted to just touch on a typical project management system and setup, and discuss a couple of the issues that I've had applying a traditional project management system in a startup, and then kind of back up and see, okay, in startups, they're run differently than commercial organizations. What does make sense in terms of implementation of project management? So we'll take a look at the entire life cycle of a MedTech device, what the project management needs are. We'll break it down into stages, and really dive a little bit into what project management needs makes the most sense at various stages, and then recommendations. So about me, I know what I wanted to do. I want to say hi to all my friends. I saw a bunch of people log in that I know. So hello to Matt and Marianne and Shelly and everybody else. Thank you for coming. I am what I studied in school was chemistry, and when I was nearing my bachelor's degree, I started to look into technical jobs that I could do, not really knowing much beyond, going to work for Dow or 3M or something. I didn't have a lot of understanding of what a chemist does for a living. So when I started to look for my first job, I got a job in MedTech, and I just stayed there. I had no idea at the time that MedTech was even a field. It makes sense now, but at the time, I didn't even, it was off my radar how medical devices get into physicians' hands. I started in MedTech in 2000. And that was a startup. They've all been startups. I love startups. I've worked for one public company, but we went public while I was there. And that's about when I started to get really bored and frustrated and left. And so I know myself. I know that I'm better in a startup situation. I counted them up, 18 total. 7 of those have been full-time, and then I've consulted quite a bit in the last 23 years. Consulting gives me more flexibility to experiment and tune my methodology. So I've been doing that a lot more. What got me into project management was being a chemist. I started off in materials development in the lab. I only did that for a couple of years because although I like the science, I am way more outgoing than putting on gloves and a lab coat every day and sitting at my station with my lab notebook. So just wanted to start. I was very curious about what are the marketing people doing? What are the clinical people doing? What are the regulatory people doing? And so I think there was a natural fit with my personality and going into project management. Another thing is in R&D where I started, I have a hard time completing tasks or doing things if I don't understand how it fits into the bigger picture. And so from that perspective, project management made a lot more sense too, as I could zoom out and see what are all the things we need to do, how do they fit together, and how does what I'm doing or what anybody's doing move us closer to the goal. And it's similar, just my personality has kept me in project management along the way. But what really pulled me into project management and kept me there was that it's difficult to implement project management at a startup. You kind of start with zero project management, and somewhere towards a commercial organization, you need a full project management office. But how do you do that in between? It's something that's tricky, and I've seen both sides where there's not enough project management and where there's way too much project management. And I've never seen a good description of the way it should go in startups. And so I've come up with sort of what works best for me, what works best for my clients after years of trial and error. So quick overview of traditional project management. This is what what's described in the textbooks online. Anytime you look up project management, it generally follows this path. There's 2 phases, a planning phase and an execution phase. And these are the players involved in project management. Up here, you've got the management. Oh, I guess you can't see my cursor if I'm over there. There's the management, at the top. There's the team down below who's doing the management, has the budget. They're the decision makers. They can assign, allocate resources. The team are the individual contributors, and then you insert a project manager in between the two. And in the very beginning, when I go to plan a project, or when you go to plan a project in this system, first step is you've got strategy, budget, resources, constraints that come from management in the form of project information that gets fed to the project manager. What am I working with? What am I what's available to move this project forward? And then the team provides the detail on exactly what tasks I'm going to perform to move this project along. How long are the tasks going to take? What order do they go in? Things like that. From there, from the information that I've collected from management and the team, I create a schedule and communicate that out. And then in the execution phase, so distinct planning phase. In a traditional project planning system, you would do this all up front and then move into execution. And so the same people are involved in the execution phase. What are we doing day to day as the project moves along? I'm getting, instead of initial project information from management and the team, I'm getting status. As the project moves along, we've run into an issue, something's delayed, something went faster than it was supposed to, work was eliminated and we didn't need to do it at all. I update the schedule and sort of manage that. So if I've got a delay at the team level, they'll communicate it to the project manager. The project manager will communicate that to the management. Usually there's a step in between where the team will tell the project manager about a problem. the project manager will run a couple scenarios to figure out what to do about the problem, and then go to management about that. So that's the day-to-day management of a project. This is fine for a larger organization that's commercial, that's got a separation between the management and the team, multiple projects going on. The team may be assigned to multiple projects. This is a good system to manage that. Typically, you would have an entire project management office and department that that focuses on just the project management of this. But it's overkill in startups. First of all, it's too much overhead. Usually, in a startup, you don't need a project manager because your management is much closer to the team. You've got small teams. This might be a small engineering department of 2 or 3, maybe an engineer or 2 and a lab technician or something like that. And then you've got the VP of R&D. So you got really small teams. The management and the team don't need a project manager between them. So putting an actual physical person in, at least in the early stages of a startup, doesn't make a lot of sense. But another unique thing about startups is this schedule. There's no real planning phase that starts and finishes. The planning goes on throughout the project. We are startups by nature are, if it's a disruptive or innovative technology, we don't really know what the path ahead is in great detail. And so what we're doing in startups is, instead of creating a plan and a schedule and then moving into execution, we continue to plan throughout the life of a project. And so in this scheme, really, schedules are not built traditionally to be updated in a major way like we need them in startups. And so two of the unique features of startups are that this planning phase continues all the way through the execution, which is unusual. And there's real no need for a project manager in the early stages here. The team is small and much closer day to day to the management. So what do we do about that? Let me check my other notes here. Okay, so because the planning phase is spread out through the execution phase in startups, I like to look at what's going on, what are the schedule needs at every stage of startup development, and then what are the management needs. So I've broken it down into what are the continuing planning requirements, and then how does the management go, and how do we start small in the early days and then grow that throughout the project in order to have the project management done smoothly. Let me delete my annotations here, and then we're moving on. Okay. All right, so how do I do it differently in startups? And what I'm calling a startup is a pre-commercial organization. For several reasons, it's easier to think about in a pre-commercial setting and describe it in this way to start. Okay, here is a typical startup life cycle. It doesn't always go this way. It almost never goes this way, but this is what we plan on in the beginning. We've got some initial concept development in the beginning here. We move into verification, validation. Let me just annotate here. So in the beginning here, we're doing early design work, prototyping, preliminary testing, and then we move into this design verification phase here. And then another phase for clinical, and then commercial filing / commercialization are the 4 areas that I like to break this life cycle up into, and they have distinct project management needs. And so I like to kind of break it up into these 4 categories. You might have something that looks like this that you've created for a pitch deck. This is great in the beginning because it's a good way to put out our at least estimated version of the schedule in the very beginning. You might be using this for board meetings, investor pitches, communication with the team, anybody else. But this is usually the level that we start with. And if you've created this, okay, Adrian, yes.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a question.
Okay.
They want to know, what software do you use for your Gantt charts?
Okay. For what we're looking at, I use a PowerPoint add-in called Office Timeline, and I will add a slide with all the software that I use at the end before I send these out. Okay, so to create this, I use a PowerPoint add-in called Office Timeline Pro, and it's wonderful. It's really good. Another tool that I use, my main Gantt chart tool, is Microsoft Office. I have an add-in for that as well called ProChain that really does a good job with analysis. It calculates buffers. Critical path is super easy to analyze with ProChain. So main is Microsoft Project with the ProChain add-in. I can actually, if I create a Gantt chart in Microsoft Project, I can export into this tool directly from the MPP file, which I like. So I can flag activities, milestones that I want to propagate over from the Gantt chart into this, and then I can just export in. So I love this tool. Office Timeline Pro is what I created or what I used to create this. Okay. Where was I? Okay, so those are the four stages that I break a project up into. These guys here, and then we'll go into detail. Today, I'll go into detail, each one broken down individually, what's going on in the project, what are our project management needs. But I just wanted to, this isn't a technical talk on Gantt charts, but I thought it might make sense to give a couple pointers here. What I do when I'm first creating this is, even in the Gantt chart, even in Microsoft Project, my initial version of the schedule has about this level of detail into it. I try to only put in work that's going to drive at the very beginning, work that's going to drive the timeline. So all of these tasks you're going to be held up on your clinical filing until your verification validation is done. You're going to be held up on commercialization until you get approval or clearance from the FDA. You're going to be held up on even starting design verification until you have a design freeze. So things that actually drive the schedule, I pull those out. I use that to create my initial schedule because it's so much easier to work with. If this is my version 1 of any schedule, and really I have my important milestones, the work that's going to, my important milestones here, the work that's going to drive me to that milestone, and I use that to focus I use that to create my initial schedule, because I can make major changes really easily. There's not a lot of information in here. If we want to add a pilot study and see what happens to the schedule, it's real easy to do with the stripped down version. So step 1, I just take the information, the details that are going to drive the timeline, make a simple Gantt out of that, and then there's this exercise of putting the milestones where we want them. When we put the initial schedule together, usually the milestones are outrageously long. We go through an exercise of pulling those in. It's a lot easier to do with this amount of information. And then what I do is I layer in the other deliverables. Once I've got my overall timeline worked out, my milestones are in the right place, then I start to layer in deliverables that aren't driving the timeline, financing, design control deliverables, phase reviews, things like that should theoretically not drive the timeline, and we need to do them, but we keep them out of our way of driving the actual timeline. I don't ever, even when I add in the deliverables that don't drive the timeline, I try to always stay away from putting the amount of detail in, like a document. If I have an FMEA in my timeline, I don't go to the trouble of putting person 1 reviews it for 2 days, person 2 reviews it for 3 days, or the change order. I leave all of that stuff out of my timeline in any case. And then another trick that I just wanted to mention here, again, this is not technical, but another quick trick is in a startup, I will focus the detailed timeline on the next milestone only. So I'll have the work leading into the next milestone detailed out so that I have a good idea of when that's happening. And then everything after I will have in a more rough form because it's going to change. And one of the things I've been stuck on in the past is putting too much detail into the later part of the schedule and then just having to change it anyway. So what I'll do is identify the next milestone, really plan out my project well to the next milestone, and then roughly keep this scheduled, but not in too great of detail. And then I'll just do that as I move along. Once we pass the milestone, I'll focus on the next milestone, really map out, really get detailed about the work leading up to that milestone, and leave everything else fuzzy. That keeps me sane as I'm creating project schedules. Okay. So to go to the first stage, the product development stage, which is right here in the schedule, there's not a lot going on. And so this is where I don't recommend overdoing project management in any way. You're doing, it's mostly R&D work, it's models and drawings, initial prototypes, some preliminary testing. You might be identifying and contracting with component vendors, design verification vendors, but it's a pretty linear path. You're doing that work. You're starting to plan out verification, validation, starting to plan out a clinical trial, but the day-to-day is just this work that's focused on getting to a design freeze. The schedule is linear. It's, like I said, it's mostly an R&D. I recommend at this point that an internal resource does the scheduling and the management. But again, if we go back to the diagram of traditional project management, the teams are small. There's no need to insert a project manager at this point because most of the work is in the R&D group anyway. That's probably small. It's linear. You don't need much of a schedule. You don't need a project manager. I will say if you've got an internal resource, if you've got nobody that can do a Gantt chart really well, it's not a very sophisticated Gantt chart that you need here anyway. You can easily train somebody or have them self-train on how to do a Gantt chart here. Any questions on this stage here? Okay. On to verification validation. Now, when you've gotten through design freeze and you're ordering components for verification, getting those components, doing first article inspections, doing a build, sterilization, what have you, it starts to get complicated. It starts to involve other groups, like you've got manufacturing, supply chain, operations at this point, outside vendors doing sterilization, possibly doing production, who knows? It gets kind of complicated. Here's where it starts to get a little bit more complicated here, but the main thing that trips me up in this area is we've got more than just R&D work going on. And one of the things that has tripped me up in the past is keeping earlier on in the product development stage or the concept stage, the Gantt chart made sense to be owned by R&D because it's mostly R&D work. But now we've got work starting in other departments too, and it's sort of, you're starting to outgrow just the schedule being maintained by the R&D person. You've got cross-functional work going on with several, parallel work streams now. Work's not all linear and sequential. It's going in parallel. You might be preparing an IDE filing or something like that. So it's involving different groups. What you're planning on right now is you're kind of starting to get the clinical trial preparedness underway, identifying investigators, hiring the clinical team, creating clinical documentation, but the work is mostly in R&D still. Another good reason to start transitioning the Gantt chart specifically out of R&D here is that the R&D person is say that they own the schedule before, they're busy right now. Once these studies get underway, they're dealing with failures of these of the verification tests, production, writing reports. There's multiple verification tests going on in parallel. So the R&D person has their hands full in this stage, and starting to transition the schedule specifically out of R&D makes a lot of sense here. I recommend, if you still wanted to handle it internally, you could assign it to the Gantt chart to somebody in quality, regulatory, a little bit distanced from the work, or you could start to pull in a contractor. I still don't recommend a project manager at this point. You've still got small teams that aren't doing very much and are very close to the management. Adding a project manager here is usually a negative because they're it adds a lot of confusion over who's the decision maker, where do I get my day-to-day marching orders from. So schedule wise, I think you could transition this out of R&D, or it makes sense to transition out of R&D, whether that's to another group or to a contractor. But the day-to-day management, I still wouldn't recommend adding a project manager here. All right, on to the next stage, the clinical stage. This is where it looks like there's not a lot of R&D work here going on, but often there is a lot of R&D work here going on. So I just wanted to point that out. It looks like there's this sort of dead time, if you will, between verification and commercialization activities. But this is when R&D is still, even though it doesn't show that way on the schedule, extremely busy. They're supporting cases in the clinical trial. There's complaints and failures coming out of the clinical trial that R&D is assessing every single one of those. And usually there's some sort of a redesign effort that starts up here because you're learning things about how the device functions in other people's hands, and you're going to add features, make something smaller, make it bigger, make it longer, all of those things. So there's a heavy amount of R&D effort going on here. Another good reason to not have the schedule be maintained by R&D. Asking R&D to manage the clinical team, the regulatory team, is just sort of, you've outgrown that at this point. It's about as, even though it doesn't look like it, the Gantt chart is about as complex as it was before. And here's where I recommend, not only you've transitioned the schedule out of R&D to somebody else, you want to start allocating part-time, at least project management here, internally or contract, depending on your situation. And again, these are basic guidelines. Every project goes differently. Some of them go dramatically different than this. But I wanted to kind of start with the ideal situation, or the ideal case of a product life cycle. Here, I do recommend that that both the schedule and the management are transitioned to a dedicated project management resource, so that everybody can, the clinical team can keep the clinical trial on track. What they're doing is they're very busy. The clinical team can't manage the project either. They're activating sites, recruiting patients. If anybody's ever been through a clinical trial, more often than not, right in here, you are trying to increase enrollment as much as possible during the enrollment. And so I think it makes sense here. Everybody's really busy to have a separate project management resource doing the schedule and the actual managing itself. And then for commercial readiness, so that was clinical. Once we get to this part of the project where we are submitting our commercial filing, we're doing a lot of stuff all at the same time. One thing that I've run into here almost every single time I go to commercialize a product is we always underestimate the marathon that this is going to be, and we don't start planning soon enough. So just make a mental note when you get to this stage. There's no such thing as starting to plan out commercialization activities too soon. Even if you're not spending money on commercialization or triggering any of the work, it still makes sense to really get serious about planning for commercialization. One of the biggest reasons why is here, unlike the other stages, all of the work is ending at the same time. So you want to time everything before this stage. You're waiting for a milestone. You're waiting for IDE approval to start a clinical trial. You're waiting for the clinical trial to complete to submit your commercial filing. Here, you are trying to estimate when the commercial filing is going to be approved or cleared, and have your website, your logistics, sterile product in hand. You want a sales team trained in the field and ready to go as soon as you get approval, so there's no delay. And so here it takes just extra careful coordination. And here I recommend a full-time project manager to do the scheduling and the management. This is involving, it's highly cross-functional. It's involving marketing and sales, which, you know, have been loosely involved up until this point, but now it's go time for everybody, and everybody's really busy. Everybody's so busy that communication between the functions starts to break down a little bit here. And that's where I think having another reason to have a full-time project manager at this point makes a lot of sense, to make sure that that all the communication is happening, all the meetings are happening at the right time, all the action items that are cross-functional are tracked down, and the work really stays on track for this product launch. So kind of to summarize, the way that I have described sort of, this is a summary of how I've described how I approach project management in startups. It's working our way into it in stages, not only in separating the schedule from the management too. So the schedule and the management can be managed internally very easily in the beginning, but then the first thing that starts to happen is the schedule grows beyond R&D. You want to move that schedule out of R&D's hands. That's something that trips people up, but at the same time, don't put a project manager in too early if you've got a very small team that is communicating really well. Hold that off until later. During the clinical phase, when the R&D team is really busy, the clinical team's really busy, regulatory is ramping up, then it makes sense to have not only the schedule, but then management of the project pulled out of R&D and really done by somebody who's more dedicated, either part-time or full-time. And then once you approach commercialization, definitely want a full-time project manager in. You want them in early so that they can do all the planning and hit the ground running when those activities kick off. But it really takes a lot of very careful coordination at the commercialization stage. And then my conclusion here, nothing I haven't already said, so I'm gonna just end here and see if there's any questions.
Okay, so we have a question.
Okay.
Where can a startup find a contract project manager?
Well, I am obviously. There are project managers. I think LinkedIn is the best way to go if you're asking for where to go. I just recently have done Google searches and nothing really comes up, especially something to keep in mind with project managers is you want somebody with MedTech or biotech experience, because they're going to be familiar with the regulatory component of it. A construction project manager, they might vaguely, know about inspections and things like that, but really having your head wrapped around regulatory filings for OUS clinical studies, regulatory filings for IDE, US clinical studies, commercial filings, somebody with that experience. You're really looking for a MedTech person. You can search on LinkedIn for just startup project management consultants and find us. But then if you want to kind of skip some of that work, my contact information will be in here. You can reach out and I can either, it depends on the case, work directly with you or recommend you to a friend. I've got some definitely some folks that I know that I can make recommendations for.
For those interested in a career in project management, what are some key developmental features to target?
Key developmental features. The big one is really learn how to make a Gantt chart. Really focus on how to make a simple Gantt chart so that you can keep working with it throughout the life cycle of a project. I wouldn't. Okay, my own personal bias here is that a PMI certification is not needed for, especially for startups. You're going to learn the traditional method that was on that one slide that I had. It's just often overkill in a lot of ways for startups. And so if somebody was going to go for a career in project management, first, just decide if you're more interested in startups or more interested in stable commercial organizations. If you're going for a stable commercial organization, great, start learning online. You can get hours and PMI learning that way, and then maybe a little bit more formal courses and get your PMI certification. That would be one chunk in how I would approach it for the larger commercial organizations. And then in startups, learn how to make a Gantt chart. It's more scrappy if you go that way. I like it, but I would avoid all of the formal training and just go to, how do I make a Gantt chart? How do I, make sure that I make it well enough to be able to navigate around it quickly? And then maybe start straddling. A lot of the startups will have a half-time engineer, half-time project manager position open. That's a really good foot in the door to start if you're looking for startups.
Next question, what approaches have you successfully utilized to streamline the transition for management of projects from the R&D team to the project manager?
Usually just cold is fine, because if you do it at the right time, you haven't if you wait too long, you've already overloaded this poor R&D person, and then it takes longer to do the transition, because there's a lot more stuff happening in the project, there's a lot more baggage. But if you bring in a part-timer or a full-time project manager at the right time, then it's just a quick, sort of a meeting, sort of a download of information, and then here's the schedule, take it from here. Maybe the project manager can take over the team meetings or something like that. But if you do it at the right time, somewhere around verification, validation, it's pretty smooth.
Do we have any other questions before we wrap up?
Not for me.
Perfect. We have put a survey in the chat. We would love for everyone to take a moment and fill out the survey for us. Travis, this was great. This was amazing. I got a lot out of it, and I hope everybody else did too. So thank you so much for taking the time to prepare and to present. We really appreciate it. It's been an outstanding discussion. There's been some good questions. And thank you for sharing your methodology for managing the projects efficiently at the startup level. I want to let everybody know that this has been recorded, and we will actually be sending this out to you along with Travis's slide deck, so you'll have all the information. Of course, feel free to let us know if you have any further questions. And be sure to check out our events page on our website, because our next Lunch and Learn is on December 7th. And it's about inclusive leadership. So we would love to see you there as well. But I think that gives us, we're going to give you back 20 minutes of your time.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. This was fun. It was I think something that's much needed in startup worlds, because people just lose their minds with project management, and we didn't even get post-commercial, so there will be another one, an add-on for commercial post-commercialization, when things really get complex.
Wonderful. Okay. Well,
All right.
thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.